Welcome back to the podcast Unbinding the Bible. This is episode 156, Blessed are the Peacemakers. And on the episode this week, I want us to focus in just on Matthew chapter 5, verse 9, which says, Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And I want us to talk a little bit about what peacemaking is, and I want to talk about a little bit about what peace faking is, and then raise a few other questions that have surfaced for me. I want to share with you a few things that I've been wrestling through in my own life as I've listened to other podcasts and have read other books. But I think this is an important message for the church today. And as I was studying through several of the Beatitudes, this one jumped out as one that I'd like to give its own episode. And while I won't do this with every one of the Beatitudes, I am thinking about doing this with the very next one, which is, Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. And assuming that my schedule unfolds the way I imagine it will, that one will be the topic for next week on the podcast. So this week, it's talking about the peacemakers, and I want us to think of a few things that we might not normally think of as it relates to peacemakers, and hopefully you'll find this episode encouraging. So without any more of an introduction, let's just get right into it. As we begin this week's episode, allow me just to read a quote from Thomas à Kempis, which I think will help set us up perfectly for the topic for this episode. Here's what Thomas à Kempis says: All men desire peace, but very few desire those things that make for peace. Let me read that one more time. All men desire peace, but very few desire those things that make for peace. And I think that that is a beautiful way for us to start this conversation, because Jesus is offering a blessing for those who are interested in peacemaking, and that is restoring God's shalom to the world. And this, again, is why it's helpful to remember that these are descriptors, because these are, in fact, descriptions of the kinds of people who are blessed by God, when in reality, so much of the world isn't really as interested in people truly bringing peace the way Jesus did. And so I do want us to take a little time in this episode to talk through this. I probably shared this with you before, but in my own life, I've become, over the last several years, really intrigued by personality tests and Enneagram in particular. And I believe that I see myself most clearly as an Enneagram 9, which in the descriptors and the titles that they give for each of the 9 numbers on the Enneagram 9 happens to be called the peacemaker. And what that means in the Enneagram system is that the Enneagram 9 has this ability to see things from all perspectives, and there is a really deep drive within Enneagram 9s, and I feel it and experience it every day, for there to be harmony amidst everybody who's involved in some kind of a community or a family or a group or a church or whatever. There's this deep desire to bring together all of the perspectives and come up with a way of functioning where everybody feels that their opinion counts. And that sounds great. And there are lots of times in my life leading a shared ministry, for example, where I'm trying to be the pastor of 2 churches simultaneously, both an Anglican church and a Lutheran church, and trying to listen to perspectives on both sides and stand in the middle and try to help both groups understand where the other group is coming from. And there are days when I do that well, and there are other days where I don't. Because one of the downsides of the Enneagram 9, or the weaknesses of that group, is that oftentimes in a setting, a 9 will feel so strong of a desire to bring harmony to the group that the 9 will most often withhold their own view from the group. They won't always share their perspective. They won't always offer their opinion because they don't want it to be in conflict with anyone else's. And so a 9 takes what they believe is a sense of self-sacrifice by not offering their opinion into the mix, and yet what tends to happen then is that the 9 kind of experiences this like low boiling anger and frustration all the time because their views really aren't coming to the surface. And so in Skye Jethani's book, the What If Jesus Was Serious, he gives a little illustration on page 36, which is what I'm holding in my hand right now. And he talks about this. He talks about this peacefaker, this person who is silent, or they pretend that everything's okay when it's not, or they dodge conflict where they don't want to deal with it, and they try to appease the masses by being willing to sacrifice one thing or the next. And I like the language of peacemaking versus peace faking because I experience that personally. And I know that there are times when people say, "How are you?" And I'm fine, because I don't want to ruffle the feathers. I don't want to go through that argument. I don't want to go through that conflict, which would be necessary to bring about actual peace. And so I pretend as if the peace is already there. And I like it when other people do the same. I don't like it when conflict is created or conflict is generated. And yet, as Skye writes in his book, he has the hill of avoidance and a man standing on this little small hill onto the right of his page, and he calls him the peace faker. And this is the guy that goes for silence or pretending or dodging the issue. And then he has Mount Conflict, and he has a man hiking up the mountain who he calls the peacemaker. And in Mount Conflict, in the pursuit of peace, you have conflict. You've got pain. There's a struggle. Misunderstandings might ensue, both as a result of your attempt for peace and maybe what's already going on. Sacrifice is involved. Anger, as I shared with you, I get angry at times because my perspective isn't really coming to the center. There's disagreement. We need forgiveness. There sometimes is compromise. We've got to work through these things. And the picture itself is really powerful. And I was on a walk, I think it was maybe a year ago, and I was just on a walk through our neighborhood, and I don't know if I've shared this with you already on the podcast, but it's worth repeating. And I was just pondering what the Gospels tell us about Jesus, who we know is the ultimate bringer of peace. Paul doesn't mince any words when he tells us in Colossians 1 that in Christ all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And so Jesus' very life and his death and resurrection were ultimately about bringing real peace, real shalom to the world. And yet, as you read through the Gospels, it's amazing to me how much conflict surrounds Jesus' life. Again, the life that is the bringer of peace. And so there's a real fine line between recognizing that I'm just creating conflict because I'm an argumentative kind of person. Now, don't misunderstand me here. Jesus will have plenty to say throughout the sermon, as well as in the rest of the Gospels, regarding people who are just argumentative or who are difficult. We'll look next week at those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, not persecuted for being a pain. There's a difference. And sadly, sometimes the Christians want to throw up the flag of persecution when they're just being stubborn and difficult and hard to get along with. And when their life is made difficult as a result, that's not persecution. That's just the natural consequences of being a jerk in the world. So don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that just because conflict followed Jesus wherever he went, that he was just somebody to stir up trouble. No, but as the bringer of peace, and as the bringer of shalom, Jesus is bringing the presence of justice. That's what shalom means. That's what it means to be a peacemaker. And in order to enter into that kind of peace, all forms of injustice will need to be addressed. And this is why I think it's really important to recognize that what Jesus is after is he's after an explanation of the kinds of people who have kingdom mindsets on their hearts and minds, and they might not receive praise and thanks from the world around them, but in the kingdom, they receive blessing because these are good endeavors. These are good things to strive for. And so this is precisely what Jesus is after. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And I think in our own lives, you and I can be called sons of God, and are, quite literally, but we take on the character that resembles our Father, which is precisely what to be a son of God actually means. Jesus was the divine Son of God and was the Messiah who was labeled the Son of God. But in the same way that Jesus was the bringer of peace, the bringer of justice, we too can follow in those footsteps when we seek to bring it about in the same way. And so for me, as an Enneagram 9, when I speak up and share my perspective as a valid perspective to bring to the group, and I also listen to the other perspectives as valid perspectives to be brought to the group, and as I weigh all of those angles in which thing appears to be the best for the community as a whole, I am bringing about the work of peacemaking. And I need to do that as a pastor by resolving conflict. And conflict avoidance is something that I used to do a lot. I hate conflict. I don't like it, and I avoided it. And it occurred to me when I was on that walk that if conflict surrounds Jesus's life to that extent, then to the extent that I avoid conflict, I am to that extent still unlike Jesus. Now, I don't carry that truth around as a badge of shame. I just realize my avoidance of conflict might in fact be my desire to be a peace faker. Because sometimes conflict is not always bad. Some people, and I know how it feels because it feels negative to me to have conflict. But in any healthy relationship, for instance, conflict is not only inevitable, but it's good because it gives you an opportunity to hear the desires and the longings of the other person. And then you share how you're not looking at it in the same way. And when both of you value each other's perspective as well as your own, and you're willing to listen as you share your own opinion without getting too defensive that you don't feel that your perspective is being listened to as well as you're listening to the other perspective, if you're able to set aside agendas and set aside ego long enough to listen and truly pursue what is best for both people, much more beautiful things come as a result of those relationships than when one person just doubles down and demands that they get their way all the time. And so for me, I've had to learn that. I've actually had to learn, and this sounds kind of silly, and maybe I'm just flowing as I'm thinking, but I process these things quite a bit, and I came across a fascinating Instagram post several weeks ago. And the post asked, are you an asker or a guesser? And it went on to say that some people, as a result of passivity or codependency or things like that, things that I have struggled with in my own life, an asker will just ask for things that they want directly. They will ask for what they want, and they will just, can we do this? Can we do that? And they are fine receiving no as the answer. That doesn't throw any shade on them. They don't mind that you've, turned down their offer. A guesser is someone who has grown uncomfortable with receiving no as an answer. And so they drop subtle hints. They play this guessing game of trying to imagine when the person to whom they are about to ask this question is only going to say yes, then they feel comfortable asking the question. And so they're always guessing. And they're trying to imagine what is going to happen. And this post suggests that to an asker, who again asks for what they want directly, guessers feel passive, they feel deceptive, they feel shady. And to the guesser, who is much more passive and cautious, to a guesser, the askers feel aggressive, they feel controlling or overbearing. And I couldn't believe my eyes or my ears or my heart or all of the above when I read the post, because it describes me perfectly. I am hesitant and have been for many years when I ask a legitimate question or something that really means something to me or something that I want. if somebody responds with no, I oftentimes have internalized that as not that they're, rejecting my suggestion, if that's even the way you might say that, but rather that they are rejecting me. And I didn't like the thought that a person was rejecting me. And so I would never put myself out there, if you will, because I didn't know how to handle it if it wasn't well received, or if I wasn't well received, or I would internalize the comments that were made and make them all about me. And I think what Jesus is stating when he talks about blessed are the peacemakers is he's realizing that people who put themselves on the line, people who put themselves out there for the purposes of reconciliation, or for the purposes of peacemaking, or for the purposes of justice or shalom, most likely are going to have a rough go of it, because the people in the world who are perpetuating their own views, which may in fact be unjust, they're not going to appreciate you offering a perspective which is going to bring hope and healing to one person, but it in fact might seem to disadvantage the privileged ones who are already in a position where things are going just fine. And so I see this operating on an individual level, and I see it operating on a communal or on a social level. And to just give you one example of this is to recognize that Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers. We know that Jesus is the bringer of peace, and we know that conflict always centered around his life, his teachings. Even when he did a fantastic miracle to the religious leaders, he was doing it on the wrong day. He was doing it in the wrong way. He was not honoring their understanding of the interpretation of the law. And again, the Sermon on the Mount is filled with that kind of discussion, which we'll have time to get into in future weeks. But those who are being critiqued, those who are being challenged, those whose ways are shown not to be as righteous as they thought they were, typically don't like the things that the bringers of peace are suggesting, or the bringers of peace are saying, or what is actually going on. And in 2020, maybe 2021 now, I can't remember, there was a book that I picked up called The Great Sex Rescue. And it was written by a woman and her daughter, and then one other friend of theirs who is a statistician, really. But the author's name is Sheila Ray Gregoire, and she owns, or she hosts a podcast. She hosts a blog. It's called Bare Marriage. And for several years now, she has been talking to the Christian evangelical community about the healthy and unhealthy discussions that go on in churches surrounding sex, and surrounding sex in marriage, and teachings that teenagers receive, and teachings that women are taught, and teachings that some Christian denominations perpetuate in the name of biblical truth, but are actually very lopsided. They're very men dominant and patriarchal, or they're very harmful toward women. And these are not discussions that, go away easily. Rather, in this particular book called The Great Sex Rescue, the authors are attempting to look at evangelical Christian teaching through marriage, relationship, and sex books over the last 30 to 40 years, and to simply read the material, evaluate it in light of the scriptures, and then also evaluate it in light of the health or the unhealth that it has actually created and is currently creating in Christian marriages. And they asked hundreds of different questions to over 20,000 Christian women. It's one of the largest surveys, I think, to date for something that surrounds this topic. And what they did in asking their questions was they took quotes from all sorts of books. And what's so fascinating to me about reading this is that I read many of these marriage and sex books that they reference. And I know many of the points at which this did not create health in my own church, and it didn't create health in my own marriage. But as I'm reading these books, I realize like they're not trying to, slander another author or, cut down on somebody who's in the church, but they realize that some of this teaching that is present in these books and that is perpetuated through conferences and church DVD series and small group discussions and the like have actually done great harm to women. And they're not making this up. They've actually asked the women. And what I find is fascinating is instead of just posing a question, which you might word in one way and make it lean toward one perspective that you're looking for, instead of doing that, they simply asked questions that are coming directly out of these marriage, relationship, and sex books. They didn't put a quote and say this is coming from such and such a book, but they put the quote in there as the question and allowed these women to answer. And the results that they came up with make up the bulk of this book. And it is tremendously insightful and tremendously humbling as a man to read what is actually being taught by Christian authors and comparing that to the way Jesus actually talks about men and women and marriage and how the Bible talks about sex and how it relates to what is actually flourishing for both man and women. And what I listened to just this past week was a podcast episode on the Bear Marriage podcast, which is very interesting to listen to. I find it fascinating, quite honestly. Was an hour and 20-minute discussion about how the various authors that this author critiques in their sex book, how those authors have responded to the teaching that has now come out saying, well, we understand this person's perspective. This is what they wrote, but this is actually a harmful thing. And here are many, many examples of ways in which this is harmful to people, not actually helpful. And this is nowhere to be found in the Bible, but this author is perpetuating this belief. And what the Great Sex Rescue does is it calls out the books that are circulating in the evangelical Christian community, and it calls the authors by name because they're the ones writing these books and speaking on these tours. And what was really, really fascinating is how few of these authors like being critiqued by Sheila Ray Gregoire in this book, The Great Sex Rescue. Now, why am I bringing all this to your attention? Here's why. Because if you read The Great Sex Rescue, it comes as an absolute balm, a soothing balm of hope and love for women who may in fact be in marriages where sex is not viewed as a mutual thing. It's been very lopsided and one-sided in the name of biblical teaching. This book provides a soothing, healing balm. It provides shalom for marriages. It provides shalom and peace for women. But in order to do that, or maybe because it's doing that, it simultaneously has to look at the current state of Christian teaching that has not provided such a balm for women. It's not provided shalom for marriages. And it has to address these issues directly. Because if it doesn't, then those things continue to be believed, and then you're left with nothing. You can't have a wrong belief and then just introduce a new belief into your life and hold them both and try to experience shalom. What is disrupted shalom has to be named, it has to be faced, it has to be repented of, and it has to be forgiven. Then you can experience the shalom that Jesus has come to bring. And so what's happening is many of these Christian authors who understand, have, I'm sure, made money and have made some sort of fame and have sold lots of books and have gone on the conference tour, no doubt are probably not super thrilled that that time could come to an end if some of their teaching is shown actually not to be helpful. But these authors in their responses have more or less demonstrated, we don't like you pointing out that what we're saying is not helpful. And it's funny because most of the authors, they reached out to either personally, wrote something to them directly before the book came out, letting them know what was going to happen. And many of the authors responded with, we're not disagreeing with anything you say, but you're twisting our words. We never said those kinds of things. And again, if you read the book, The Great Sex Rescue, it is thoroughly footnoted. And of course, these authors said these things because Sheila Wray Gregoire is not making up what she thinks they're saying. She's quoting those books verbatim and citing the page and the book that it's coming from. And I have some of them, I used to, on my shelves and could go look up the information if I wanted to. But each of these authors responded with, we don't really disagree with anything you're saying, but many of them came up and said, we don't like the way you're doing this. We think you should come to us privately and talk to us privately. We don't think you should be using our names and citing our books. You should say things like, well, some teachings suggest this, but we really think it's this. And what they cite is Matthew 18. And they say, if you have something against a brother, you should go to him privately and you should deal with that relationship. And it's fascinating because that's not actually what Jesus does. Jesus gives that instruction in Matthew 18 for interpersonal relationships between a person and another person. But that's not what's going on here in these books. These books that are published in public and conferences that are taking place in public. This is very public, very known information, very known authors, very known books. And when you want to bring truth and you want to bring peace and you want to bring restoration to broken, hurting marriages where women are often told things that are flat out unbiblical and men are given the freedom to act in ways that are unbiblical, then these things need to be talked about publicly. I guarantee you the number one reason why Jesus got in so much trouble with the religious leaders was because everything he did was public. Everything about Jesus's life was public. Now, how you go about doing that is another topic entirely. But read the book for yourself, The Great Sex Rescue, and ask whether or not you think they did it in a tactful way. I listened to their episode in addition to reading their book and have come to the conclusion that they don't hate these authors. They're not upset. What they want is for them to recognize that the teaching is not in line with the scriptures, to apologize for that, and to, if they come out with a second edition of their book, correct what's going on. But I just notice that when an attempt to bring healing and restoration and hope and shalom to thousands of women who've expressed tremendous frustration in their marriages as a result of Christian teaching on sex and marriage, it requires undoing the bad teaching and exposing the peace faking and exposing the wrongful ways of walking through these kinds of things in order to bring the truth. And I fear that this is why conflict is inevitable. Conflict is not a negative thing. And I have to say that to you, not because you don't believe it, but because half my life I've not. And I need to remember that it is not. It is an inevitability when you are attempting to bring real restoration and hope into a world that doesn't already have that. It is going to conflict. The kingdom of God is going to butt heads with the kingdom of this world. And let me tell you, there is a lot in the Christian evangelical church that is more in line with the kingdom of the world than it is in line with the kingdom of God, which makes the violent, conflictuous fireworks in the church potentially more explosive than outside the church. The reason being because those inside the church have so long held to their views and have attached their views to what God approves of that they think, who are you to challenge that? Who are you to challenge me? Who are you to try to upend what I've been saying for the last 20 years like I'm a licensed therapist? You can't challenge me. You can't question me. And Jesus is saying, blessed are those of you who are trying to bring real peace, real shalom, real restoration, real healing. You shall be called sons of God. It isn't easy, but it wasn't easy for Jesus either. Jesus' pursuit of peacemaking took him straight to a Roman cross. Jesus' pursuit of bringing shalom got him in trouble with all of the religious authorities. But Jesus knows that the world is in that much need of shalom that he's willing to do it. And so he says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. Not the peace fakers, not those who pretend that everything is fine, not those who imagine that the way the church testifies to the world is by showing the world that we never have conflict. You know, I've been in churches long enough to know that this is almost universally believed in the church. It is almost universally believed that if we were really faithful followers of Jesus, if we were really doing the work of the kingdom, we wouldn't have conflict in the church. I don't know why people think that. I really don't. The question isn't whether we have conflict. The question is, do we know how to rely upon the Holy Spirit to such an extent that we work through the conflict in healthy, mature ways? That's the question. Because the church is not exempt from the troubles that plague this world. The church, however, has been equipped with what we need in order to navigate those troubles. So please, if you're part of a group who thinks that because there's conflict in your church, that that's somehow a failure, it's absolutely not. It can't be. Conflict is an inevitability. Healthy conflict in a marriage is an incredibly good thing, which you would never imagine that a couple who never has an argument somehow has a deeper relationship with one another than a couple who argues 3 times a day. The question isn't whether they argue and how much. The question is how they go about resolving the argument, how they go about restoring the relationship after some potentially snide comments were made, or somebody's feelings were hurt, or someone felt like they weren't being listened to. What does restoration look like in a setting like that? That's where the church shines, is in their ability to navigate through the difficulty, not avoid the difficulty, because avoiding it is peace faking. It's not peacemaking. That's not bringing restoration. It's pretending as if everything that is already there is perfectly in line with the ways of the kingdom, which would be silly because we're not experiencing the full force of kingdom life now. I'm certainly glad we're not, because it's pretty pitiful if that's all the best Jesus can do. We're always hoping for more. We're always longing for a closer walk with him and with one another. And we can have it as we pursue real peace, confronting places of injustice, pointing out things that potentially are harmful or that work against real shalom, and then in its place, offering teaching, guidance, truth, hope that points people in the direction of the kingdom, in the direction of Jesus, to set the captives free and to provide a place where people's lives can really, truly flourish. So that is all the time I have for this week on the podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you have not yet left a rating or a review for this podcast, I would encourage you to do so on whatever podcast app you choose to listen to these episodes. If you'd like to email me, you can reach me at unbindingthebible@gmail.com. And again, if this would be an encouragement to someone or an episode you've listened to in the past, please share it with a friend so that they might join the community of us trying to unbind the Bible. Thanks a lot, and have a great week.